Mary Murphy is going to come up and introduce the panel. After this panel, we're going to do some breakouts. We're going to divvy the room up into a number of groups. We have facilitators sitting around the room, as well as some volunteers from the Federal Reserve staff to help take notes. And I already promoted, don't worry, I already promoted the report. I just don't have a copy. Here it is. I didn't have a copy to hold up. Here's the copy. You have it. I expect you to study it and savor it. It's because it's got actual examples, 10 best practices for rainy day funds, including the enabling legislation or constitutional provisions. If you want to take it back to your state house and write a law, it's all the text is there. Just before, I'm going to take like 60 seconds before we start the panel. It's my turn to give out a shout out and thank you. Number one, again, to the fabulous Federal Reserve staff from the president on down. Thank you so much. Number two, to the fabulous Volcker Alliance staff. Some of them have gone off to podcasts or other means, but apologies if I've left anybody out here. Tom Ross, Sarah Moglescu, who had to leave for family reasons, Nelia Stevens, who's in the back of the room, Melissa Austin, who's running the show in the back of the room, Matt Fabian and Lisa Washburn, who are municipal finance consultants, and Tom Doe, who's their founding partner. Thank you to you. Thank you to Maya Corin for keeping the time, working on the registration, and keeping us all honest. Thank you to Noah Wynn-Ritzenberg, who is riding the video stream and other tech from his office in Hilo, Hawaii, believe it or not. So hello and thank you to Noah. And also thank you to our research team members who flew in today. Merle Hackbart from the University of Kentucky. Juliet, there you are. Juliet Tennant from University of Utah. Alex Hathaway from Georgia State, who's been around here, and if I've omitted anybody, let me know, and I'll thank you at the next round. But let's get on with rainy day funds. If you're planning to fly back to the New York area or to New Orleans, it is raining, so that's what we save for.
Actually raining.
All right, thank you, Bill. And again, my name is Mary Murphy with the Pew Charitable Trust. I also want to thank the Volcker Alliance and the Atlanta Fed for hosting this terrific discussion. I'm very excited to get to be part of it. Talking about rainy day funds is a truly exciting subject to me, so I'm very excited about the next couple of hours. As Bill mentioned, we're going to use this panel. I can do a little promo. We do have Katherine, Barrett, and Greene to talk about the report that you have in your materials today. And then we also have Senator Jack Hill from Georgia and Gabe Petek from California LAO to share some state-specific experiences and to talk about how some specific aspects of rainy day fund policies are playing out in their states. We're hoping that this will provide some fodder for the conversations that we will be doing in these breakout groups in the next hour. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit before we move into the panel discussion, Bill brought up some of these points in the intro, I think, at the very beginning of the conference today. But when we look across the United States right now, I think there's a lot of good news out there, right? It's been a long period of expansion, of growth. 48 states now have formal rainy day funds. In this long period of growth and expansion, we've seen states build up those reserves, which is what we would expect and hope to be seeing over this period. The National Association of State Budget Officers and their very good data on state reserves and rainy day funds noted that in fiscal year 19, the median balance across the U.S. will reach an all-time high, or has reached an all-time high. That's 7.5% of state general fund spending, so that's reason to be optimistic. 37 states estimated that they would increase their fund balances in this fiscal year, and another 32 states are projecting to add to their rainy day funds in FY2020. That's all good news. I think there's a lot of reasons that we've seen these balances grow. One of them, of course, is that the economy's been growing. Revenue growth has been a bit sluggish over these 10 years, but in particular, the last 2 years have been strong years for states. But even beyond those sort of underlying fundamentals, I think we've seen a real sort of recognition across the United States about the importance of strong rainy day fund policies and policies that drive strong savings, discipline around savings, and then thinking about really how much a state needs to be holding in reserves to be prepared. So for example, and I know that all of our panelists I think are going to touch on this point, but prior to the Great Recession, it was just 9 states that had a savings rule that was directly tied to volatility in the state. Now that number is up to 20. We've seen 19 states raise their savings targets or their fund caps since the recession, recognizing that those caps were too low, that states weren't saving enough before the Great Recession. That's all great to see. It is, of course, not all good news. Although those median numbers look very strong, when we look at individual states, certainly not every state is sort of at the point they might want to be in terms of being prepared for the next recession. A Moody's analytics report that came out in September 2018 that stress tested state budgets, which I know Juliet was talking about a bit this morning, found that 23 states have enough in reserves to survive a moderate recession without raising taxes or cutting spending. So it's obviously less than half of the states. And between fiscal 15 and 18, which were growth years nationwide, we saw 21 states withdraw from their rainy day funds. In some cases, those were prudent fiscal choices. Not all states are sort of at the same point in the business cycle, and some of those states made withdrawals for good reasons. But when we see states pulling down on reserves during growth periods, we want to sort of ask about what's going on there. So with that as sort of introduction and setup for our panel, first I want to turn things over to Katherine and Rich to just give maybe a short summary of the report that folks have in their hands if you haven't had a chance to speed read it yet today at your tables, just to give folks a sense of what's in the report.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. And I should preface by saying how grateful we are to have you moderating this panel. Katherine and I were consultants to the Pew Charitable Trusts forever until fairly recently, and Mary was one of the brightest stars in their constellation.
You're
so we're
kind.
very grateful to have her.
I didn't ask you to say that. You're very kind.
No, if you asked me to, I would know. So it was mentioned earlier in the day that at the end of last year, the Volcker Alliance released a report called Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting, Preventing the Next Fiscal Crisis. I know it was also talked about as to what the 5 areas we covered were. Better? As to what the 5 areas we covered were, the one obviously that we're focusing in today is rainy day funds. It's interesting, when you do a big report like the prior one, you wind up with a lot of really interesting data, a lot of really interesting information that you just can't fit in, or you wouldn't be writing a report. You'd be writing, War and Peace, and people don't even read long reports. Today, as we talk about reserves, we're going to be able to utilize, as we did in the report, a great deal of the detail that didn't actually find its way into the first report, but we thought was pretty important. We think this is a particularly timely topic, and the folks we work for and with at the Volcker Alliance thought it was an important topic, in large part because, although, as Mary just said, the rainy day funds are getting fuller and fuller and fuller, and that's a really good thing, the question of a recession may not be a question of if, it's more a question of when. And come a recession, suddenly the world's going to be a very different place. Suddenly people are going to be relying on the rainy day funds, relying on the policies that kept them in place, relying on the policies that prevented them from being withdrawn exuberantly. And so this felt like the right time. Again, the basis for the work on the paper, and here's where I'll close up. We looked specifically at the statutory and constitutional policies for rainy day funds, showing state by state what they are for withdrawals, for funding, and for how they define volatility, a really interesting topic that I'm sure Mary will lead us to later on. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a spoiler, we're going to walk through a couple of questions that are going to mirror some of the questions that you'll be talking about in your groups. So hopefully we bring up some interesting ideas that will foster some more discussion in your groups. We're not going to have Q&A for this panel. We're hoping you will take those discussions to your rooms. So first, before we even get to sort of how a state can best determine the right time to save, I'm wondering if both Gabe and Senator Hill can talk a little bit about the commitment to saving and the extent to which that was a political question or a discussion that had to really be sort of worked out within your legislatures in order to sort of drive the next steps in policy, and how you sort of got to the point of being committed to building strong reserves. Senator Hill, could you talk a little bit about that in Georgia?
Well, I'd have to start with the point that Georgia is one of the things that we brag about as being a pro-business state. In fact, every level of government in the state ad nauseum proclaims Georgia is the #1 state to do business, and that mindset, though, has worked wonders, I think, for us in operating as a conservative state and not getting ahead of ourselves under the guise of trying to impress the bond underwriters, because the AAA bond rating for our state, which we've maintained for over 20 years, has become good politics. And both Democratic and Republican administrations in our state have kept that AAA bond rating and set policies in place that continue to build that confidence from the bond underwriters. An important part of that, or two important parts of that, are, of course, pension payments that we routinely make, the payments that we're supposed to make that are required by the actuaries. But the other part of that is the building of our RSR and our revenue shortfall reserve. That has become part of the political landscape of good government in Georgia that people brag about when they run for office. So we haven't had to have an agreement with everybody. It's just been something that, of course, the governor's a very powerful CEO form of governor in our state, so we don't have to have, he doesn't have to have our acquiescence to do that, but it's been very supportive by the legislature. The other thing the legislature hasn't done either is to pass Tabor legislation that restricted revenue sources and what to do with revenue as we got better. We didn't pass any of those. We've also done things like increased our transportation taxes when we needed to, which made our revenue levels continue to be consistent. So all of these have been good politics, and I think I would say that lacking we haven't had to have agreement because of that.
Mm-hmm. And you're bringing up the importance of the strong bond rating also certainly sort of makes sense in this context. Gabe, could you talk a little bit about California's experience, and I think particularly coming out of the recession where California's experience was so dire and dramatic, and how that may have sort of played into a commitment to building strong reserves?
Yes, I think in California, that's actually the important place to start, is to remember that by 2009, the state was facing a cumulative fiscal deficit of $60 billion. So for the current year and projected out for the coming fiscal year, they had a combined budget problem of $60 billion on a $100 billion annual budget, roughly. So it was truly a catastrophic and scarring experience, I think, for the members of the legislature at the time. And it helped, I think, develop a mandate for Governor Jerry Brown when he came into office. He was elected in 2010. And that was really job number one, was to stabilize the state's finances. And a big part of that was at first just kind of dealing with the crisis at hand, which was a very severe cash shortfall or liquidity problem. And then subsequently, once they sort of stabilized the situation, he continued to focus on the state's finances and put forward a proposition that went to the voters, Proposition 2, and that was passed in 2014. And it set up the state's budget stabilization account, the BSA, or the rainy day fund. And I think that that required political leadership. So, your question kind of has to do about the political environment. It really required political leadership, and I think the legislature deserves credit for working with the governor to put that forward and put it onto the ballot. And then, the thing I wanted to say that is important, I think, is that rainy day fund, the state has adhered to the provisions of it over the subsequent years, but they've actually gone further and built larger reserves than what the rainy day fund rules would require. And so, the political leadership or the political component part of it has continued to be important. And I won't say that there's always 100% agreement on how large the reserve should be, and there's differences of opinion on the margin, but in general, you talk to the different members of the legislature, the chairs of the budget committees, they are definitely on the same page about not wanting to go back to what happened in 2008, 10, 11 timeframe.
Mm-hmm. And you started to touch on this a little bit, but getting into the mechanics or the policy questions about when to save and how should states think about both the best time to be saving and the sort of two for benefit about thinking about identifying one-time or non-recurring revenue that might be best dedicated to saving instead of sort of baking it into the ongoing budget. Rich and Katherine, I'm wondering if one of you could talk a little bit about what you found in your research and what's in this report about how states are sort of innovating in terms of identifying strong savings policies and how tying to observed revenue volatility kind of varies across the states and how states might be making progress in this area.
Sure. In terms of when to use the money, it needs to be said first that the state legislatures can do pretty much whatever state legislatures want to do. So though the policies that we looked into for the report were all based on statutes or based on elements of the state's constitution, the legislature can ignore what's in statute from year to year. So though we may say this is how it's done, and that's what the state says is how it's done, it may not actually be how it's done.
I think one of the things that we found in looking at the statutes was that states have become much more careful about, how they will use the rainy day fund money when it comes to doing that. Back when Rich and I have been observing rainy day funds and how states have used them from the early 1990s, and attitudes really have changed a lot. And one of the ways in which they've changed is kind of just viewing that money that's being saved as a little bit more sacrosanct than it used to be. I think that places were much more eager to use the money that they had saved. There was a lot more political pressure not to save money in the past. And now when we've looked at the policies, we're seeing more states saying not only, like, we have the money there, we want to make sure that when we do spend it, we can spend it in a reasonable frame, not all at once. So for example, North Dakota, which did spend some of its money a couple of years ago and for good reasons, spent it very quickly. And they just put in new policies to say, well, we have this rainy day fund, we've built it up again, but we need to make sure that we're cutting at the same time that we're using the rainy day fund money so it doesn't all go suddenly.
And just to tag on, because it's funnier than anything else, years ago, when Connecticut was just entering a recession, they had used up their whole rainy day fund the prior year when the economy was booming. We talked to the state finance director, who explained to us that they had spent their rainy day fund money the previous year in anticipation of a rainy day. We made a lot of fun of them at the time. They got mad. It didn't matter. But still, this kind of thinking is pretty much a thing of the past.
And Senator Hill, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mechanics in Georgia in terms of the budgeting process and how you think about savings sort of built into the budgeting process, and maybe how your approach in this state sort of works well here in terms of actually building strong reserves.
Well, in Georgia, as I mentioned, we have a very strong CEO form of government. The governor, I think the legislature would like to think we are part of the leadership team, but frankly, as Scott Holcomb knows, the governor holds all the tools and all the cards. And that's a good thing because in many ways it's run like a business. There's a good bit of conservative planning that goes into the way we handle. The governor is responsible for the revenue estimate. There again, holds the sole power of setting the revenue estimate. That begins the process. The way we do our budgets, though, he presents a general budget, and the plan is for everything to compete in that for funds in that general budget. That's usually, though, a low in the range of estimates he gets from the state economists. Historically, and I say this historically through both parties who've run the state, they have chosen the low estimate on the low side in the general revenue estimate, so that at the end of that year, if revenues, first of all, if revenues grow, then you've grown a built-in addition to either consider spending it in the amended budget or going into the revenue reserve fund. So that's the way that's the plan, the way that we have operated over many, many years, is the first revenue estimate's low. Then we have an amended budget that's considered in the middle of the year. That budget is considered just for truing up formulas. It's also the one time the legislature appropriates out of the RSR, in that we take 1% for education and growth. That's the one access to the reserve fund that the legislature has. That in effect, though, causes a secondary effect, and that's why I wanted to mention about the budget process and the way the executive branch operates. At the end of that of each fiscal year in June, they begin to try to accumulate through allotment holdings and control over agency spending. They try to accumulate enough funds to cover that 1% reduction that's going to happen out of the reserve fund, which is a very smart thing to do. But that's just part of the way we operate every year, and it's something that nobody really even realizes they're doing it. But that works out for us. So the amended budget, the Senate set out a set of policies to try to control amended budget. There was always an attempt many times to spend money in that amended budget. So we try to get a control over that. And I think today we really do have a very good control over that spending. So all of these things point towards then the end of the year, where any funds that are taken in revenues that are above our appropriated amount lapse into the reserve fund. When you're growing, and thank goodness we're a growing state, that provides that amount every year that continues to build that reserve.
Mm-hmm. But just especially the importance of being conservative about those estimates, so that
the budget estimate is the first step and the most important step. Yeah. And as I said, we'd like to have more input into that revenue estimate. And I actually passed a bill to give us some more input, and my roommate and friend, Governor Sonny Perdue, vetoed the bill, so it didn't work.
If I could just tack on to what the senator just said, there's a double benefit to the way Georgia does things. Not only do they continue to keep the rainy day fund stocked by conservatively estimating revenues and then taking what is then the surplus and putting it into the rainy day fund, it also stops the state, and could stop many others if they follow Georgia's path, from using those surplus dollars on ongoing expenditures, which is a big mistake and happens all the time. You have a surplus, you assume the surplus will be forever and a year. You spend the surplus on raises, new programs, any number of things, and then the next year there's no more surplus, and now you're doing cutting, or you're trying to raise taxes, and that's hard. So this is another reason why Georgia's approach is such an enviable one, I think.
Well, I think that is a great segue to asking Gabe to talk a little bit about the 2014 policy change that you already mentioned, but really isolating a very volatile revenue source as a way to both build reserves and think about addressing some of the state's long-term liabilities. If you could just talk a little bit about the mechanics and how that's been working in California. think it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, well, in California, they set up the provision so that every year we take 1.5% of our general fund tax revenues off the table right up front, and it gets transferred into the budget stabilization account. Well, actually, hold that thought for a moment. And then we also look at the amount of revenue that we are collecting from capital gains tax revenues. And any portion of that revenue that exceeds 8% of general fund revenues is also segregated for the Proposition 2 reserve provisions. Once we've calculated the total amount that should go into the reserve, we actually, for the first 15 years of the law being on the books, we take half of it to pay down budgetary debts or other supplemental payments to our pensions, for example. And that is something of an outgrowth, I think, of in the crisis years, we had resorted to a lot of internal borrowing, deferral of payrolls, deferral of payments to schools. And by the time Governor Brown took office, there was $35 billion in budgetary debts, in addition to our long-term bonded debt, our pension liabilities, OPEB liabilities, and $70 billion of deferred maintenance on our infrastructure. So the $35 billion was just another part of our whole package of liabilities. So for the first 15 years, we were to be paying that down, and actually we've already paid down all of that as of this current budget year. We have completed the payoff of those budgetary debts. And, you know, it does, I will say this, the concept of putting funds in a rainy day reserve for a state government is very much a zero-sum trade-off, right? Like any dollar that you put into the budget stabilization account cannot be spent on programs, nor could it be given back in the form of tax cuts to the taxpayers. So, you know, you're consciously making it a priority to build up a reserve that can cushion the effects of an economic downturn. But let's not lose sight of the fact that there are real, you know, political trade-offs involved in making those kinds of choices. And I think it's not always easy for policymakers to think, you know, further ahead down the road to when the next rainy day might occur. Especially, you know, we don't know when it will occur. We don't know what the size of it will be. Right now, California has $19.5 billion in total budget reserves, and we don't really know. I mean, that's the highest they've ever been, but we don't really know what the size of the next deficit will be in a downturn. That's to be determined. Sheila was talking about it earlier. California's tax revenues remain susceptible to stock market correction or other events. Our budget reserve is also there to accommodate natural disasters, the wildfire problem, you name it. So, you know, we hope that we're getting close to what would be necessary to withstand the effects of a mild to moderate recession, but I guess time will tell.
This is such a great panel. This is the perfect segue into my next question, because I wanted to talk a little bit about how to determine the right amount to save. And certainly since the recession, there's been a lot of sort of pointing to these old guidelines of 5% and then sort of widespread agreement after the Great Recession of, oh, that's not enough, and it was picked somewhat randomly. But how do we think about really what the right savings targets are? And again, to the point that Sheila made earlier about you are taking money out of the economy, so you want to be careful about how you're approaching that. Senator Hill, maybe you can start and talk a little bit about how Georgia has thought about setting its savings targets, which are significantly above 5%, and how that has been sort of serving the state.
We had statutorily, we had a 10% cap, which would be in one way of saying a 10% goal for our RSR prior to the recession. And we went through a process prior to the recession, and we fought back a Tabor type of attack because we had legislators who were saying, that's enough reserve, whatever you've got, this is enough, this new revenue we're getting, and it doubled in a year, our reserve doubled in a year. That's way more than we need, and there was a lot of discussion. like months before the recession hit. We fought that off and didn't pass that legislation, and that was a fortuitous move for sure. But then during the recession, we used up what the reserves we had in like 1.5 budgets. It was gone. It was gone in 18 months. I mean, it just disappeared. Not to mention the federal funds that we received I mean, I don't know what we would have done without them. It was really, really incredible because we lost 25% of our revenue just overnight almost. So after the recession, we increased our cap to 15% and have been working towards that goal ever since. I think now we don't have to fight that battle of how much is the reserve that we need. And I don't know what anybody believes the goal should be, but I think the recession proved that whatever you got, it's probably not enough. It's like the cost of living is always 10% more than what you make. I think whatever you have is probably not enough, but you do need some target to shoot at, and now we've used 15% to shoot at, and we're at 11.1 today, and we're moving that way.
And certainly acknowledging that no state could have built sufficient reserves to weather the Great Recession without some pain. That was an unusual economic event, and no one could have built that level of savings. But how do you get maybe closer to what might be appropriate for a moderate downturn? Katherine, did you want to?
Like I think we've seen a real shift in attitudes about rainy day funds, because there was a lot of pressure that we saw in the early 2000s and the 1990s to give money back to taxpayers. You know, your money's come in more than you expected. What right do we have as a government to hold on to it? We need to give it back. And then 2 recessions, and then the particularly severe recession between 2007 and 2009 really made the point to people that they needed to, they couldn't give this money back. There were too many needs here, and there was too much need to sustain a government during a recession. And it's not just that the revenues drop, it's that the expenditures go up during a recession. I mean, all the people who depend on government services and the need to keep up the infrastructure, and maybe even particularly the fact that when investments go down, suddenly all of your pension contributions are going to go up. So there's just a really, much more of an understanding of that, and then also much more of an understanding that every state is different. And so the whole point of looking at volatility and looking at what you require as a state, and if you have very consistent revenues and a nice package of different taxes that will mean that you're not dependent on any one set of taxes that are going to drop, then it really matters, that you think as a state or as a city about what you need to have to sustain you.
And just to come back to your question of what's the magic number, there is no magic number. For a long time, there was a magic number, and it was 5%. And in the early 90s, if you interviewed states, they would tell you those states that had rainy day funds, they were all shooting for 5%. I interviewed Hy Grossman, whose name may be familiar to some of you. He was a very senior guy at Standard & Poor's at the time, trying to figure out, I spent days trying to find out where that 5% number came from. And Hy said, well, you can blame me. I was speaking before a big conference, and and the question came from the audience, so what's the right number? How much should you have in your rainy day fund? He said, and I didn't have an answer, so I said, I don't know, maybe 5%. And I can show you all kinds of academic documents for years that followed saying 5% was the magic number. I didn't believe it. I mean, we quoted him at the time as saying, well, I never really believed it, I just sort of kind of said it. But it got to be set in stone. What's changed, and Mary mentioned earlier on that we've now got 20 states, Connecticut just joined the list, so they're up from 19 to 20, that tie what they put in, that create the number that they aim for, with some kind of a determination of how volatile their revenue streams are. If you're a state like any of the big natural resource states, You're going to have a lot more highs and lows, just depending on things totally out of your control. The price of oil, the price of gas, the price of whatever's under your ground. So those states need to have bigger rainy day funds than a state that may have a much more balanced set of revenue streams that one will counteract the other. And so one of the major points of the report, and really one of the big takeaways of the report, was to, from the Volcker Alliance's perspective, to encourage states to consider tying their rainy day funds to some kind of a measure of volatility. And in the report, we outline different ways to define volatility, because that in itself is another question.
But I think this point of both connecting your deposit and withdrawal rules to volatility, but then also using a more empirical approach to thinking about the right savings targets is such, I think, an exciting sort of shift in how policymakers are thinking about these questions. And again, coming back to some of the stress testing conversation that came up earlier, but whether it's states looking more rigorously at the revenue side and sort of revenue risk exposure, or states going a step further and looking at both the revenue and spending side in a downturn, because there are going to be those counter-cyclical pressures as well. I think is a very sort of exciting development. Gabe, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about California's approach to sort of thinking about those target numbers that come out of the LAO in terms of recommending savings.
Yeah, so one thing I would just add to this is that it's very challenging because, for example, in California, we know that the capital gains component of the personal income tax is very volatile, and it can be a significant portion of the state's tax revenue. But so far this year, the state has seen about $130 billion worth of companies that with market capitalization of $130 billion that have gone public. That's up from a typical year around this point, we would have $50 billion in IPOs. $130 billion in IPOs has translated to a large increase in tax collections, but the form of those tax collections is in the wage withholding, because most of the increase is in the stock grants that the employees have that become vested. They're not capital gains income. And so even though our rainy day fund is designed to trap the excess revenue from a surge in capital gains, it isn't designed to trap the excess or the surge in revenue that is actually wage withholding, because it's in the form of stock grants. So there's a vulnerability right there. And so arguably, that's why I have kind of gone back to this point that the political leadership remains important. Of the state's $16 billion in the rainy day fund, around $3 billion of it is in the form of supplemental contributions that the governor and lawmakers have made over the last couple of years. And we think that's actually a very important part of the state's overall portfolio of budget reserves. And so, we did a forecast in the fall of 2018 and did baseline growth and then kind of a moderate recession, and we estimated that the state would need $20 billion in reserves. Another key thing, sort of somewhat depressing, is the estimated need for a $20 billion reserve. In that case, we're assuming that the state will lower its funding for education down to the constitutional minimum, which could mean several $billion of cuts to the education system at the state. So if the lawmakers didn't do that, we would need a reserve of more than $20 billion. And this is just to kind of get through a mild to moderate recession type of scenario. So it remains an ongoing challenge, and we just try to do our part to kind of point out these issues to the legislature.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's worthy of note, just for a second, when you have a chance to read the report, you'll see that we have 10 action points, 10 guidelines for having a healthy and successful rainy day fund, and 2 of the 10, the examples we give, are exactly what Gabe was just talking about in California, and exactly what the senator was talking about earlier on in Georgia. In one case, the use of surplus money, and in the other case, the guarantee that that deposits are made into the rainy day fund from capital gains taxes, which are in a state with a really progressive tax system, a great source of regular funding.
And I also just want to sort of call out and highlight, I think, the value of these kinds of robust analyses that we are seeing sort of in a handful of states now, where it's, I think, driving a more concrete level of planning prior to being in a recession, and hopefully helping lawmakers avoid more of those crisis-driven decisions, but where you've put some numbers to, here's what we're assuming we'll have to do, providing some sort of tools and a framework for thinking ahead about how the state might manage through those downturn events, I think is a sort of exciting new development in the space.
The other thing is, by taking some money off the table during the good times, you're constraining the growth of the spending base. So the deficit that you're dealing with when the downturn occurs is that much smaller. So it actually helps you in two ways. You have the money in reserve, but you also have probably a smaller deficit than you would have had if the spending trajectory was at a higher, or spending was on a higher trajectory, excuse me.
And a lesson that many jurisdictions, states and locals, learned in a painful way heading into the last recession, right? Where in some cases, budgets were being built on unsustainable revenue growth, and then the cuts were that much more painful when, admittedly, a very severe recession occurred. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left before we shift into our group discussions. So I want to use this as an opportunity for our panelists to provide any final takeaways that we didn't get to, and particularly, I think, lessons from either your states or from your 50-state research that you think are especially sort of important for policymakers, for folks in other states, for analysts to be thinking about in terms of what it means to build a strong reserve and the best way to get there. Rich and Katherine, why don't we start with you from the report, and then we'll go to Senator Hill and close with Gabe.
I think one of the things that we came up with was how important it is to replenish the rainy day funds, or to have a mechanism in place to do that once you've spent them. So two of our action points pointed to Rhode Island and Florida, which both have ways to make sure that when money is taken out, money is put back in. So that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And the companion item to that, and again, this we give state-by-state detail on this, is having rules to govern not just when you take money out, so that it's not easy to just sort of spend the money on some fun stuff, but also having some kind of stipulations as to when you should be putting money back in again. As Katherine just said, an empty rainy day fund isn't a rainy day fund. Though you'll have states argue to the contrary, that they have a rainy day fund, when in fact the rainy day fund will cover, sort of 20 minutes of the state's operations.
Yeah, 9 states have 2% or less in the rainy day funds right now.
And I'm sorry, I've just gotten the signal. So Senator Hill and Gabe, I am sorry to cut you short. You can bring your comments into your group discussions. They will be the beneficiaries of your wisdom. I will turn things over to Bill, who I think is going to give us instructions about where we go next. But, well, folks, please thank our wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm sorry to give the panel the hook. We do want to stay on schedule. It's a long day, and we don't want to risk people not making flights or buses or MARTAs back home. Number one, this is going to mark the end of the live stream. Thank you very much out there in Webland for watching this. The entire proceedings will be archived at volckeralliance.org, and you can also download a copy of our Rainy Day Fund working paper, our call to action, at volckeralliance.org, as well as a bunch of other great budget publications. So that's number one. Number two, let's do some housekeeping details and instructions. We are now going to do Rainy Day Fund group therapy. I'm sure you have never done this before, but you're going to do it now. So we're going to divvy the room up into 1, 2, 3, 4 different groups. You'll notice you all have table numbers, and your table numbers will tell you where you're going. There'll be There'll be Fed staff out in the break area. Go out there, pick up a soda, coffee, popcorn, cookies, cake, whatever carbohydrates you need and caffeine you need to get through the rest of the afternoon. And then here are your assignments. Folks on the dais, whichever tables you are at is where you're going. So in the Redbud Magnolia room, which is right here, getting the signal from the back, that's tables 7, 8, 14, and 15, facilitated, this is a facilitated discussion, by Barrett and Greene and Tom Ross when he returns from his podcast down in the basement, and Fed intern Angelica. Angelica, are you with us? Yay, hold up your hand. Okay, so 7, 8, 14, and 15, get your snacks, come back in here. Number 2, in the Azalea room, out there somewhere, that's tables 1, 6, and 9. 1, 6, and 9 goes to Azalea with Edgar. Edgar's right here. Thank you very much. Number 3, Dogwood room. I love dogwoods. Dogwood rooms. Lisa, in Azalea, by the way, Mary and Melissa will be doing that. In the Dogwood room, Lisa and Maya will be joining Brittany. Hey, Brittany. And that's tables 5, 10, and 11 to the Dogwood room. And finally, in the Jasmine room, Thad and me. So we have the New York guys, along with Grace. I figured that's you. That's tables 3, 4, 12, and 13. 3, 4, 12, and 13. If you haven't memorized all this, don't worry. I have the key. And before I go out to where I'm supposed to go, which I've forgotten, before I go to the Jasmine room, I'll stand here with the assignments. And then everybody's going to come back here and have a final debrief.